welcome you all. Give you all an official good afternoon now that it's noon in New York. I'm 2 hours behind, so I'm still, it's still morning here. So yes, my name is Allison. I'm from the University of Calgary, and today I'm going to be presenting on some findings from a critical discourse analysis we had completed and recently published on the statements released by academic medical organizations following the murder of George Floyd. So I don't have any conflicts of interest to disclose, but do want to just clarify that my views and opinions don't reflect those of my employer potentially or necessarily. And I do want to give a bit of a content warning just for some discussions and images relating to police brutality, racism, and violence. And also just state that I'm committed to using inclusive language practices as best as I currently understand them at the time of this presentation. It's very important to me as a settler to recognize and honor the history of the land and the Indigenous people who've long resided on it, and where I'm presently an uninvited guest on. So I'm presenting to you today from the traditional territories of the Blackfoot and the Treaty 7 people. And this is including the Siksika, the Piikani, the Tsuut'ina, the Stoney Nakoda First Nations, and is also home to the Métis Nation of Alberta, Region 3. I was recently in New York at the end of October. I recently learned that New York City is located on the ancestral lands of the Lenape and is home to the largest urban Indigenous population in the US. But since we are doing this online, I of course cannot give a land acknowledgement that captures the depth and the richness of the many places that we may be situated on. But I do invite you to consider your own position and with respect to the land that you're currently on today. So a couple acknowledgements as well before we start, just my study team for all the work that went into this. So especially the 3 undergraduate students, Favor from UBC, Emmanuel from University of Ottawa, Naomi from here in Calgary, as well as my colleague, Dr. Javid Sakara at the Yale School of Medicine and the Hartford Institute of Living. I also know it's very important to start off this presentation with some disclosures about my positionality, especially as a scholar doing critical social sciences work, because critical reflexivity is essential to our scholarship. So I'm a white settler here on Treaty 7 lands. I have British and European ancestry. My ancestors directly upheld and benefited from colonial violence. I'm a cisgender woman. I'm able-bodied. I am very socially and structurally privileged, and I continue to benefit from numerous systems that continue to oppress and harm others. That includes the system of white supremacy and systemic racism. I benefit from that as a white person. I'm in a position to uphold racist structures or work to collectively dismantle them. And I also just want to recognize that there's many challenges and problems that arise when white people are involved in anti-racism work, including the historical and ongoing performative activism and appropriation by white women. And I try to be mindful and accountable to all of these things throughout my day-to-day life, but also especially in my scholarship. To further situate this work and this scholarship, I want to give insight into the kind of sociopolitical and sociogeographic context that this work is situated. So I'm not sure how many of you have been to Calgary. It is the sunniest city in North America. That's a fun fact for you all today, based on the number of sunny days per year. Home to the Rocky Mountains, beautiful here, but also home to extremely terrible pizza that I think you New Yorkers would consider borderline offensive. But it also is, this is a lesser known fact, is that Calgary is home to some of the highest rates of police violence and killings. In 2018, we actually had more police involved killings than New York or Chicago. This is not widely publicized. The province of Alberta is quite conservative. It's an oil and gas industry. We're often called the Texas of Canada. We also are known as the rat-free province. Since the 1950s, we have a provincial policy and program that actually is on rat patrol, which is a bizarre fact. You can read more about that if that's not really believable, but literally our tax money goes towards this. And this week, it is currently colder in Alberta than Antarctica, likely due to either climate change in Antarctica or just climate change here or everywhere. And then the context of Canada, you know, you might think of us as America's hat. or thinking of as hockey, the Raptors. But Canada is a land where there's lots of historical and ongoing colonial violence. That's how our country has evolved, how it was founded, lots of anti-Black racism, and that includes in medicine and medical education. So, for example, the Queen's University here, after the Flexner Report, implemented a ban on Black applicants to its medical school, which was only revoked in 2019 and apologized for in 2019. So we have a lot of issues within our own nation. So I'm going to describe some findings from our critical discourse analysis, and as part of that, highlight some tensions and contradictions in the discourse, and hoping we can have some discussion and reflections about the implications of publishing statements, and recognizing that these statements have some strengths and limitations, but also the importance of action and concrete commitments to change. So without going into a ton of background and context for George Floyd, who we all know and witnessed, this was on May 25th, 2020. The world watched the just brutal and horrific murder of George Floyd. He was a 46-year-old unarmed Black man in Minneapolis. He died after a police officer knelt on his neck for 8 minutes and 46 seconds. And as we all know, his death is unfortunately one of many, many tragic instances where Black men and women are victims of police violence. And this includes Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, and who were just victims of police violence only months prior to George's killing. So the viral footage of his murder seemed to have sparked global protests in solidarity with Black Lives Matter. This catalyzed protests around the world in spaces and places where protests had typically not yet reached. And this included many academic medical organizations and institutions and groups of medical professionals who stood in solidarity. And of course, this was not the first time. I've included actually a photo here in the top right, which is from your own institution that I found online. And this was, of course, not the first time that medical learners or professionals had joined in solidarity, and certainly won't be the last. What was quite unique about this time was how swiftly corporations and institutions released public statements following this murder in speaking out against racism and expressing support and solidarity. It really snowballed in the days and weeks following, with everyone seeming to release statements, albeit to varying degrees. So I want to just go through a bit of a quick activity. I'm going to ask you to reflect on some statements that were released at the time. And so I'm going to show some statements, the first one here being Nike's, and I just want to ask people to maybe reflect on how they're feeling or the reactions and responses that they're having from the statement. Not asking anyone to share kind of thoughts, feelings just yet, just to kind of sit with it. So starting with Nike's, released on May 29th. So what's coming to mind, just kind of sit and think about that. Oops, the next being a statement released by Lululemon. These were Instagram posts on May 29th. They say, "This matters, so we're speaking up." Next is a statement released by the National Football League on May 30th. This one has more text, so I'll give you more time to read it. And lastly, or not lastly just yet, but a statement released by Ben & Jerry's on June 2nd, 2020, which of course has a link to a fuller statement in this tweet. And now finally, how about these Twitter posts from our own respective institutions? So in revisiting these statements and statements from this period of time, I'm hoping just we can start thinking about the wide range of approaches and messaging that just flooded our inboxes and social media. I'm hopeful you'll all agree that, not all statements are created equal and that they vary in sometimes very obvious ways, sometimes very subtle ways, but these variations are very important and require a lot of unpacking. At the time of Floyd's murder and these statements, I was in between my PhD, so I wasn't working yet in this current position, but I was working closely with the Calgary Black Medical Students Association. I was one of the 3 staff that were working with them because our medical school had released a statement here on the left. And so the Calgary Black Medical Students Association saw this as an opportunity to push for change, and they released 9 calls to action for concrete areas to address within our school. At the time, our school had no Black faculty in our administration or senior leadership. In fact, there's never been a Black dean at any medical school, a dean of medicine at any institution in Canada ever. Black students, Black faculty, Black professionals are extremely underrepresented in the context of Canadian medicine. In this first year cohort, the Calgary Black Medical Students Association, the student association was 4 students. So 4 students out of over 150 were Black. And, we've had some previous challenges in our institution, bringing issues about racism to the forefront of our dialogue. And so seeing the school release a statement and other schools release statements across Canada in response to an American incident made me really question what these statements were, considering that these were issues that in our context had never been spoken out before publicly. So what's in a statement? Public discourses like statements are important to consider because of how discourse and language is linked to power. Language reflects power, language shapes power, and language can also reproduce power. Up until 2020, academic medical organizations had largely shied away from public dialogue about issues like police brutality and anti-Black racism. Some schools have spoken out or had spoken out previously following local incidents. For example, I know Hopkins after the killing of Freddie Gray in Baltimore. But the murder of George Floyd seemed to inspire a relatively unique moment in time in terms of the mass reflection that was permeating society. And of course, academic medicine was not immune to that. So analyzing these discourses could provide some insight into how our academic organizations and schools are reflecting and responding to these societal demands for racial justice. So our study sought to critically examine these statements, the initial ones that were issued by medical schools and academic organizations. We conducted what's called a critical discourse analysis. This is a qualitative methodology rooted in a paradigm of critical inquiry, and this seeks to address social issues by systematically analyzing language as a social practice. We used Fairclough's framework for CDA, which involved 3 phases of a textual analysis, a discursive analysis, and a social analysis. We combined a series of sampling strategies to develop an archive. We wanted to really look at the statements issued by medical schools and national organizations across both Canada and the US. There's only 17 medical schools in Canada, so we did include them in our initial search, but because of the sheer volume of schools in the United States, we had to have a bit of a sampling strategy. So we used what's called maximum variation sampling. And this was to collect a range of responses across schools, regions, demographics, and historical contexts. So this included looking for responses from publicly versus privately funded schools, schools with historically Black colleges and universities, schools with a Black dean, schools with the highest and lowest proportions of Black medical students based on data from the AAMC. And we included, we looked at those schools and we included their initial statement that was on their website or social media. And then we also included national organizations that play a role in regulation in medical education and membership-based organizations. So this led to our archive, which had 45 statements, and 21 of these were from Canada and 24 were from the United States. So what did we find? To start off, our initial analysis used something called linguistic inquiry and word count. It's a kind of a software that can look at language and identify kind of patterns. So this gave us some quantitative information about the discourse and suggested that the discourse reflected hierarchical thinking, power between the discourse producers or the authors and then the readers. And it suggested there was also a very guarded and distanced discourse, and often with a negative tone. We also saw how language is used to distort and soften racism and issues about racial violence and police brutality. The words racism, racist were absent in almost a third of our statements. And in fact, one statement did not mention racism or did not mention racism whatsoever or any relevant terms. And while a third discussed racism as what they would say a systemic issue, it was rarely discussed as an institutional one. We found anti-Black racism was less commonly used to contextualize the messaging, and only one statement used the term white supremacy. In terms of discourse producers, the vast majority of statements were signed off and written by a dean or a senior leader, so written by people in positions of power, and nearly 3/4 of these authors were appeared to us as visibly white based on their institutional profile. But 4 of the 45 statements were authored by a Black author, and that 2 of those were from HBCUs. Some statements did include imagery, and this included photos of smiling deans. And again, these appeared to be visibly white. There were no statements with photos of faculty of color. 2 statements did include photos with diverse groups of students protesting, and 1 did include a mural of George Floyd. As we moved into our interpretive analysis, we really focused on identifying what we would consider dominant discourses and dominant discursive strands. And this included identifying tensions between the explicit and implied messaging that was conveyed through the production and the consumption of text. And through this, we really found quite a few tensions in the discourse. So in terms of the explicit messaging, the primary messages were often just simply acknowledging that racism exists and that is a systemic issue and is also a bad thing and therefore must be addressed. But we noticed several contradictory messages in contrast to this. First, while the statements acknowledge racism as systemic, they often neglected to acknowledge the historical and ongoing legacy of anti-Black racism in medicine as a profession and medical education as a system. And second, statements similarly neglected to acknowledge how racism manifests within their own institution. There was a reluctance to look inwards, or those that did often took what we considered a self-congratulatory approach by highlighting prior initiatives that broadly related to equity, diversity, and inclusion, or highlighting awards they received. But again, none of these awards were specific to anti-Black racism or even anti-racism. Third, we also found while that dominant discourse recognized racism as systemic, they often lacked a real commitment by the institution to be held accountable or to commit to change. While many included broad messaging surrounding that need for, social action, the statements often framed racism as something that was interpersonal and again, external to the institution. The statements emphasize needs for readers, the members of the community that they were writing to self-educate and to be kind to one another. And in doing this, they really absolved the organization of structural culpability. And we also found that 1/3 of statements did include what we considered at least one actionable step that the organization would take. But of those that did, the majority of those initiatives were targeting individual behavior change. So things like implicit bias training rather than kind of structural reform or policy change. Sorry, there we go. And another dominant discourse, and this is like one of my least kind of favorite things that I tend to see in these sorts of statements, is this idea of we're listening and we're learning. And in a way, we think this discourse alludes to the idea that institutions were not listening and learning beforehand and are therefore ignorant on these issues that they're writing statements about. And despite these notions of we're listening and learning, there was also this implied message of we really don't want to hear from you right now. Only 7 statements had any mechanism for readers to comment or provide feedback or to have voices be heard. And often, I think all but 1 were generic emails for the institution or their communications person. And so despite that notion of we're listening and learning, there was no plan for, robust engagement or meaningful dialogue. There was also a dominant discourse, kind of recognizing that it was a difficult time for everyone, and especially in the context of COVID, but acknowledging the emotional and psychological burden that was imposed on racialized people sometimes in the statements as a result of the kind of current events. And even though there was this recognition that it was a difficult time for everyone, there was kind of this underlying notion of we really don't have any appropriate supports to offer right now. So, take care of yourself, emphasizing self-care. 6 did include links to their mental health services or supports, but these are often not tailored specifically to deal with racialized trauma or the unique needs of the community. So as we start illuminating the dominant discourses, the discursive strands, and the tensions, we also start uncovering what the missing discourses or minimized discourses are. What was very, very kind of almost shockingly, but in a way not shocking, what was absent from the discourse was a kind of clear, consistent, and unequivocal support that Black Lives Matter and support for Black Lives Matter. It was only mentioned in 4 out of 45 statements. Even though nearly half of the statements used the term solidarity, only 4 explicitly said the phrase Black Lives Matter. And one of those 4 was an HBCU, and they did so over 5 times. They did reference victims of police brutality, so 30, 2/3 did reference and mention and name George Floyd. And some mentioned other victims, mainly Breonna Taylor and Ahmaud Arbery, but 1/3 of statements did not include any references to victims or reference Black Lives Matter. And we consider this a discursive conflict because these statements, were released in direct response to the killing of George Floyd and numerous other Black people, and in response to the ongoing kind of solidarity with Black Lives Matter. And in fact, we noticed a bit of a discursive strategy which dictated the appropriate responses and reactions of readers. So there were implicit propositions that constrained how members could respond in a way, or the appropriate response, in that we emphasize in the discourse kind of peace and kindness as appropriate behaviors rather than protest and activism. And in fact, one statement referenced the ongoing Black Lives Matter protests as riots. So something to think about. I think this really illuminates how Black Lives Matter, how people see it as politicized. And so something to kind of question and think about is how it is politicized, and most importantly, by whom is it politicized? So we further kind of looked at the wider socio-historical, sociopolitical, sociocultural nuances. And so one, as I had mentioned, was kind of referencing COVID as this kind of ongoing crisis that we were dealing with. We also noticed how statements often reference civil rights movements and civil rights leaders, quoting Martin Luther King Jr., Nelson Mandela. I had mentioned some did reference prior victims of police violence that were maybe in the cities where the institution was located. We did notice elements of intersectionality throughout the discourse in terms of referencing other forms of discrimination and violence. And I think that reflects kind of our social, kind of our state in thinking of equity and oppression. But then I think most importantly, we identified some nuances across socio-political contexts in the language that was used in their statements, and including how we discussed racism. So statements from areas that maybe are considered a little less progressive were less likely to use stronger language, and often use terms like racial bias or prejudice. And as I had mentioned, only one statement out of 45 used the term white supremacy. And I know I'd mentioned that there was an avoidance on stating clear support for Black Lives Matter, but also avoidance of mentioning police violence and police brutality. However, one statement did mention police and police brutality over 10 times. So there seems to be some discursive strategies to remain politically neutral, yet still making a statement. And again, these were often in states or regions considered more conservative. So while there were definitely a lot of statements that soften language, I really, in our kind of paper really wants to highlight the ways that HBCUs did not dance around the issues. The discourse in their statements was quite a contrast. There was stronger language, clearer messages, and this is just to give you an example. This was released by Morehouse. So here I've included a segment, an excerpt from the statement, and I think it nicely conveys a message of support for the community members to join in on protest. It says protest and social action is the fabric from which they're made, and it gives them guidance on how to protest safely in the context of the pandemic. And also just pictured on the right here, notice that their title sends a simple yet important message, Black Lives Matter, that's the title. And it's accompanied by a photo of students at a protest. So I'm hopeful that you would agree this sends a far stronger message of institutional support and solidarity. So we identified some major nuances in the Canadian discourse, particularly in how we minimize the historical and ongoing legacy of anti-Black racism in Canada, in general in Canadian society, but also in medicine and academic medicine. The Canadian discourse often positioned police brutality as an issue south of the border. So as if it was something in the US and not something that happens in our own country. Mentioning George Floyd, only 2 mentioned a victim of police brutality in Canada, both naming Regis Korchinski-Packett, who I've included a photo of here on the right. She died 2 days after George Floyd after a police altercation. Only 2 of our statements referenced that, or any Canadian victim. Anti-Indigenous racism was mentioned more often in the Canadian discourse than anti-Black racism, and this kind of reflects our historical and present violence that's the result of settler colonialism. And while that discourse really does acknowledge that Canada is not immune to violence, we still saw anti-Black racism and police brutality minimized or omitted entirely. And we think this reflects the tendency in Canada to really position ourselves as a neutral, peaceful country, to minimize the social, cultural, and political practices that we have embedded in our society that perpetuate violence, and to say, we're speaking out, but this is about an issue that is in another country. So throughout this process, we illuminate these discursive practices, and this is in a subset of samples of statements released by organizations in Canada and the US. So thinking about big picture interpretations, one of our most concerning interpretations is thinking about what the discourse really reflects. And we think it reflects something in the kind of sociological literature called non-racist discourse. So this is discourse that passively delegitimizes concerns about racism and minimizes the historical legacy of institutional racism, which we find positions racism as egregious and interpersonal, prioritizes individual behaviors, and that is in order to diminish the culpabilities of the systems and structures that uphold it. And we found this throughout our statements and how we kind of looked outwards and not inwards, that self-exculpatory approach. Also evident in how we, softened our discussions about racism, anti-Black racism, and then also how we failed to center the needs, voices, concerns, perspectives of Black people. Ultimately, this discourse really champions ideologies of colorblind racism, and it's counterproductive and it's harmful. And I think this is important to consider given how institutional discourse not only reflects power, but can maintain and exacerbate power structures. So, we see these messages at first glance, they might seem important. I think they try to signal institutional values, morale, but often, they lack introspection and accountability. And I'm not sure how many of you are movie buffs, but something that I think about a lot, and I'm probably waiting for the day that I can title a talk of a presentation or a paper this, is this kind of saying from an old horror movie where there's a killer on the loose and then someone is trying to find out where they are. And in the movie, she calls and they trace the call, and the call is coming from inside the house. I think these statements were important for some reasons, but also we're not reflecting that we are also cogs in this violent system. So some implications and considerations, about these statements. What were these statements, or are these statements for? Who are they really for? And what are we really hoping to achieve with these statements? And I did not title the talk, "The Call is Coming from Inside the House," but I titled it, transformative or performative. I think that question is in the eye of the reader. The judgment really depends on who we are as readers, our relationship with that institution, but also what happened leading up to the statement and what action and changes have happened since the statement. Addressing systemic racism requires much more than these well-intentioned statements, and it requires a clear commitment to institutional change and actively dismantling the racist structures that continue to perpetuate and manifest in our profession. Failure to address, or failure to take action does raise concerns about the performative nature of these statements. And I think responding to the overt forms of racism outside the institution while neglecting to acknowledge and combat the more subtle yet systemic racism entrenched in our institutions maybe raises concerns about performativity and virtue signaling, or the strategies where we try to reform our images as, progressive, egalitarian, committed to social justice, and that draws away from the injustices that we're directly responsible for. So another consideration is thinking about the authenticity and the track record that these organizations have in prioritizing social justice and equity. So I know I showed some example statements thinking about Ben & Jerry's. They have a long track record as a company whose mission and values are very much rooted in social justice. So, the statements that they release are not as much of a contrast. They're quite on brand for that organization, and they feel far less performative than, let's say, the NFL statement, considering their track record with racism. And I also think considering the pre-existing relationships with the communities that your statements are directed towards or intending to address. Are you writing to an audience you've actively marginalized and harmed, or is it an audience and community that you are actively working in solidarity with? And I want to bring in some findings from another study that we did. This is a separate team, and we just published this in the Canadian Medical Association Journal. They just released a special issue on anti-Black racism in the profession. There's some really great work in there that I'd highly recommend others check out. So this was a study we did, and we interviewed the deans or a faculty leader delegate from the medical schools in Canada and tried to interview at least one Black medical student. We wanted to look at the potential disconnect between these groups in the kind of aftermath and look at their responses in the 6 months after those statements. And one thing we looked at was how the statements were developed in the first place. And we found that medical schools in Canada often relied on the Black medical students, the few Black medical students that existed in that school, to actually write or edit their statements because they didn't know what to write or what to say. So one faculty participant quote I've included here, he says, "I'm a white male, so what do I know? But I started writing something." And then a student participant says, "I remember being irritated because they emailed us and were like, is the statement okay?" And I was like, on one hand, I'm glad that you're checking because it wasn't okay. And clearly they needed help, but it was also just like, this shouldn't be our job to help you do this. And in general, this was a consistent finding that we found in terms of how Canadian schools were responding. Our Canadian medical schools lacked intrinsic capacity to direct their own responses in the absence of Black faculty or staff. And again, which is the result of structural racism, structural anti-Black racism in Canada. And so therefore, they're relying on Black students to guide their institutional responses and action. And Black students stepped up to help because they felt otherwise the school would respond poorly. I've included a student quote here who said, "I feel like that's been a consistent theme since June in anything that's happened, where we need faculty to consult students, but sometimes the ways in which they do it, it's just like, we shouldn't have to do this particular job, but we will, because if we don't, what are you going to do? You're probably going to mess it up. You should already have people in your staff and your faculty that you can ask these questions to." And I also just want to acknowledge there's also risks of not releasing a statement. I've included a quote from a student participant that said, "I wouldn't say that the school is bad for doing that, because if you don't release a statement, then people will be like, well, why didn't you release a statement? And if you do release a statement, well, you're kind of doing what everyone else is doing." So not even just the faculty, but for most statements or actions we saw at that time was literally just because they had to, because realistically speaking, police brutality, anti-Black racism has been going on forever. And so one question I think others keep coming back to relates to this, anti-Black racism has been going on forever. So I guess my question is, why now? Is it because George Floyd's murder was so horrific and violent, or was it because it was televised? I think, yes, potentially, but what about Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, who died from police violence months before George Floyd? I don't think we saw widespread statements there. I also think about Alton Sterling, Philando Castile, who died from police violence in 2016. I think about Sandra Bland, Freddie Gray, who both passed in 2015 from police violence. There were Black Lives Matter protests then, but there were no statements on global solidarity. I think about Tamir Rice, who was a 12-year-old boy who was killed in Ohio for having a toy gun. I think about Michael Brown in 2014, shot in Ferguson, Missouri. I think about Eric Garner. This is one close to home to you guys, who died in a similarly brutal manner to Floyd at the hands of the NYPD. And I think about Trayvon Martin, who was a teenager hunted down by a neighbor and whose killing catalyzed the Black Lives Matter movement. So, when I think about people saying that it's because it was so horrific and because it was televised, I think of these names, I think of these people and all the others who their lives ended prematurely as a result of that state-sanctioned violence. When people say it's because the video was so viral, I think of all the other instances where police brutality, anti-Black racism was recorded and circulated. And I especially think of Eric Garner, actually, who was killed in a manner so similarly to George Floyd, also on video. And I just wonder where the humanity was and where the solidarity has been this whole time. And since then, thinking about what have academic medical organizations released statements about, we're seeing institutions and corporations speak out about injustices and inequities. For example, this was one at your own institution, a tweet condemning anti-Asian racism last year. Another example, my own school speaking out against the Roe versus Wade ruling being overturned, which is interesting because Roe versus Wade does not dictate our reproductive rights, but we'll release a statement about it. And also, we won't even talk about our own reproductive justice issues locally. We've seen institutions release statements about the ongoing war in Ukraine. This is one from my institution. Just last night, my institution also released a statement about the protests in Iran, the ongoing gender-based violence following the killing of Mahsa Amini. And a kind of very common one in Canada was institutions speaking out in June 2021 when 751 unmarked graves were found at a former residential school. And residential schools were the school system in Canada that was created that took Indigenous children away from their families and operated by the church in order to they had a goal of cultural genocide and for assimilation. To date, there's been over 2,300 unmarked graves discovered. We saw organizations release initial statements, but as more discoveries have occurred, we've seen fewer statements. And something to consider is, what we release statements for, how we release statements about certain issues in proximity to other discourses. So, for example, statements about the discovery of graves and Indigenous children, statements about our National Day of Truth and Reconciliation, but then also following and adhering to the very strict communication protocols when the Queen died this year. At the end of the day, this is just a reminder that, we're still a very colonial institution. And so it makes me question what the purpose of these statements are, and if they really do feel as meaningful when our other discourse and communication reflects commitments elsewhere. So where do we go from here? I think moving forward, we need to consider what we're willing to speak up for and where we draw the line. What are we willing to say or speak up about, and what are we afraid of saying? It seems as though people are still afraid to use clear language around racism, white supremacy, but also police brutality. Being afraid to say police violence for Floyd, or he was murdered by the police, and instead saying that he died of excessive use of force. I've included 2 studies here that found similarly in their analysis of other types of archives for statements. Similarly, medical schools were very reluctant to talk about police violence or reference Black Lives Matter. And I think medical schools are just a little bit reluctant to kind of critique the police as a public-facing profession. But our doctrine of do no harm is pretty similar to the police's to serve and protect. And I think sometimes we might not see ourselves as part of the same system, or maybe we do, and are maybe just afraid to condemn this profession and this violence because sometimes we operate as an extension of that system. And if we think about it, defunding the police would mean reallocating resources that would address upstream structural determinants of health. So why are we afraid to draw that line a little bit further? And some kind of bigger questions, I want to plant the seeds maybe for some discussion. Is something better than nothing? Are statements the bare minimum? I don't have answers to these questions. Would really love to hear dialogue around this. Similarly, when should statements be released? How can we make sure they're meaningful, not performative? And why should we release them? Is it to virtue signal? Is it for solidarity, or is it for some other reason? These are just some considerations that I've been thinking about, just in terms of the purpose and the authenticity, risks of appropriation, the timing of it. Do we rush a statement out to make sure that there's something out there, knowing that there's risks of taking longer? How clear is our messaging? How much do we accept fault here? And also the directionality. Are we releasing the statement in a way that's creating one-way discourse, or are we trying to create dialogue? And then also, what will we do about it? So just to summarize, I think discourse is quite powerful. It can reproduce the status quo. It can transform it. Statements, I think, have some utility if and when they're authentic, but are performative really in the absence of a clear stance, a track record, concrete action, or commitment to, and then critical introspection and humility. And without a concrete commitment to ongoing and meaningful action to eliminate the racist practices and policies that are deeply entrenched in our own institutions, clear timelines for next steps and opportunities for readers and community members to engage, I think these institutional statements will ultimately be performative, and in the end, actions will speak louder than words. And with that, I just want to thank you all again for being here today. Thank you for inviting me. Thank you for organizing this. And I just want to hear everyone's thoughts. If this is a safe space for you and you feel comfortable unmuting or using the chat box, or also feel free to